This episode was made in collaboration with Our Changing Climate. Be sure to check out their video after this. The world faces a lot of challenges. From poverty, to war, to famine, to disease, our species has a lot of problems that need solving. But there's one problem that is not only incredibly threatening on its own, but also makes all the other problems much worse. Climate change, the result of natural atmospheric changes and intense human activity and pollution, poses an existential threat to not only humans, but countless other species around the world. If we're going to mitigate some of the worst effects of climate fallout, we need to start making real changes immediately. Unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. In this episode, we're going to talk about the basics of climate change and why capitalism is not equipped to handle the crisis. Before we get into the analysis, I think we should start with some simple facts about climate change. I'll start at square zero. Climate change is happening. It is not debatable. Regardless of whether or not you think humans are causing or worsening the problem, you cannot claim that we are not witnessing serious changes to the planet's climate. The evidence is sound and overwhelming. The only detractors are people who are either A, not experts in the field, or B, paid by the oil and gas industry to spread disinformation. Usually both. Even if you're not convinced by the consensus of the entire scientific community, the effects of climate change are something you can see for yourself. I recently visited Majuro in the Marshall Islands as part of a documentary crew. We saw homes literally being consumed by the sea. Islands and coastal regions are going underwater, and this is only one of the side effects of climate change. Okay, I hope we're on the same page here. Climate change is happening, and the fallout is already doing serious damage to communities around the world. There's a certain type of person who always appears in the comments of this type of video to say things like, "Humans have nothing to do with climate change. This is just a normal part of Earth's climate cycles." I'm sure there will be some of these people on this video too. To address those people, you're wrong. And even if you were completely correct, the consequences of the changing climate are so severe that we must take significant steps to mitigate the loss of life and spiraling global crises. Think of it like this. If you're out for a walk and someone is driving straight at you and you're clearly going to be run over, what would you do? You'd do everything in your power to avoid being run over, right? Does it really matter whether the driver is purposely trying to kill you or if their brakes are out? No, because the end result is undesirable either way. The things that led up to you having to avoid getting hit by a car shouldn't factor into your consideration of how to respond. The same is true of climate fallout. So, with that out of the way, let's look at a few basic facts about climate change and its disastrous effects. We'll start with the bad news. Even if we completely stopped emitting greenhouse gases today, we've already set in motion a scenario which will inevitably release more warming agents that have been trapped in ice for thousands or millions of years. This will cause serious problems the world over. Already hot areas will face record heat waves and droughts, which will adversely affect food production. Continued warming and acidification of the world's oceans will destroy fragile ecosystems like coral reefs and threaten fish populations which billions of people rely on for food. Islands and coastal regions are at risk of flooding or complete submersion, as I documented in the Marshall Islands. As warm seasons last longer, disease-carrying insects will become more prevalent and occupy larger areas, infecting countless people with life-threatening illnesses. Farming regions will be at tremendous risk of crop failure as local weather behaves erratically or changes completely. In the developing world, crop failure and drought will combine to create massive water and food shortages, resulting in unspeakable death tolls and the worsening of the world's ongoing poverty and migrant crises. Sooner or later, oil will cease to be the most valuable resource to imperialist nations. It will be replaced by water. When the most basic necessity of life becomes a target for military action and occupation, we will begin to see suffering unlike the human race has ever seen. But this video isn't about all the specific details of climate fallout. I've covered that topic in previous videos if you're interested. What we really need to talk about is how the current dominant economic system presents an insurmountable obstacle to mitigating climate disaster. So, let's take a look at a few of the actions, as determined by the IPCC, which must be taken immediately or at least in the very near future. According to the IPCC's Climate and Land Report, we need to implement comprehensive early warning systems for extreme weather, as well as other observational programs to monitor land use and degradation, biodiversity, and the spread of disease-bearing insects. We need to fund programs that will encourage sustainable land management, which will prevent desertification and famine. We need to invest in land restoration, bringing damaged or endangered soil and biomes back from the brink. We must drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, including oil and gas, agriculture, transportation, and leisure. And we need to do all of these things in just a few years to prevent global catastrophe. Now, let's consider the nature of the roadblock that is capitalism. To offer a simple definition, capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are controlled by private owners and corporations. The primary driver of capitalism is the profit motive, the desire for ever-increasing profits and the accumulation of capital. It should be obvious that the very premise of capitalism is antithetical to any kind of long-term planning. If a system demands greater profits every year, if it demands infinite growth, it will inevitably run into the very real problem of existing on a planet with finite resources. If we look at the decisions made by large multinational corporations, say Exxon for example, it's clear that those decisions are made based solely on the amount of short-term profit they will produce. Back in the 70s, when Exxon was at the forefront of climate research, their scientists determined just how detrimental fossil fuels are to the planet. Instead of making this information public and working with policymakers to find a solution, they marked those documents confidential and launched a decades-long propaganda campaign to sow doubt on the effects of greenhouse gas emissions. By doing this, they secured their short-term profits at the expense of the long-term survival of millions of human beings. The same is true of giant companies like Amazon. Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO and the richest person on the planet, could easily afford to make Amazon employees the best-paid workers in the world, thereby securing a happy and loyal labor force and positive public perception of the company. Instead, Amazon is among the worst places to work in the country. We routinely hear horror stories about how employees have to pee in bottles because they'll be fired if they take a bathroom break, or how they've had to ignore a coworker who had died on the floor. Reducing overhead by exploiting workers yields greater short-term profits, but it turns the public against the company, causes massive turnover, and damages their own long-term survival by ensuring its workers have neither the time nor the disposable income to buy their products. This kind of behavior is common among capitalist companies, including many smaller ones. Today, it's exceptionally rare to find a job that pays a reasonable salary or offers benefits of any kind. The name of the game is reducing costs to maximize profits. That is the only goal of capitalism. So, if we can't count on capitalism to even take care of the workers that keep the system running, how can we expect it to make provisions for people on the other side of the world, or who haven't even been born yet? The scientific community knows that nothing will get done unless there's a profit to be made, so their reports often contain return on investment timelines and estimates. But if you look at their numbers, there's no way an oil executive or a cruise line CEO would go for it. Sustainable land management programs that might be profitable in 10 years? The cruise and oil industries are incredibly profitable now. Why would they take a reduction in profits when those profits are their sole motivating factor? And if the big lobbies won't go for it, neither will the politicians who rely on their donations. The most damaging industries also just so happen to have the largest political lobbies. They make tremendous profits from exploiting workers at home and abroad, not to mention the limited resources of the earth itself. And they're willing to shell out tens of millions of dollars to fund politicians and propaganda campaigns so they can keep doing it. Even if you're inclined to be optimistic and hope that these people will have a change of heart, just look at the historical record. When multinational companies set up shop in Central America, they made enormous profits. They could have paid their local workers a good wage, or at least a living wage. Instead, they were little more than slaves. The workers were brutalized by corporate paramilitary groups. They had their families threatened if they weren't productive enough. Some parents even received the severed hands of their children if they didn't meet their required quota. If these people were willing to maim or even kill their workers, why would we assume they would be willing to make massive concessions to help mitigate climate fallout? To take a more recent example, I live in Texas.
The temperature is the lowest they've seen in decades.
More than 620,000 waking up without power in Texas this morning.
During the recent winter storm that knocked out the state's power grid, it became clear that deregulation and rampant cost-cutting were a major part of the problem. Texas has its own electrical grid, separate from the country's two primary grids. The goal was to completely deregulate the Texas energy market to free it from the evils of bureaucracy. The end result, as we should expect, was rampant corruption, price gouging, and cost-cutting. Officials decided not to take precautionary measures like winter-proofing our electrical infrastructure. Because of this, millions of Texans lost power, had no access to clean drinking water, and some even froze to death in their own homes. This example is perhaps even more damning than the previous one, because it deals specifically with infrastructure. the majority of climate mitigation measures will be investments in infrastructure. If these critical projects are avoided simply as a way to cut costs, people will die. And unfortunately, I think this negligent behavior is what we need to expect from private corporations and corporate-owned politicians. The only goal of capitalism, the only thing that matters, is profit. Profits must increase every year. The entire history of capitalism is the history of the exploitation of working people, especially by multinational corporations and the US military operating in the global south. Climate change is shaping up to be the single most expensive challenge humanity has ever faced. The world is relying on the wealthiest nations, those that disproportionately contribute to emissions and consumption, to lead the way in fighting climate change. As we've seen in the last decade, there hasn't been a single administration willing to take steps bold enough to meet the challenge. All we've seen is politicians paying lip service to established science while peddling woefully insufficient policies that are rarely acted upon. If we want to ensure a livable future for the human race, we must move past capitalism. Capitalism is incapable of solving the problems it creates. It is entirely beholden to the profit motive, and no amount of flowery language, greenwashing, or reform will ever change that. If you'd like to learn more about the specifics of capitalism and its relationship to the climate crisis, I highly recommend you check out our Changing Climate's companion video. It's a great crash course on the history of capitalist exploitation of the people and the planet. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous videos by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.